Hi everyone, I'm Yusuf and welcome to Geopolity Horizons. Today we'll be looking at the topic of Pakistan. Now, August 14th is the 74th anniversary of the partition of India. This is where Pakistan and India gained independence and emerged as two separate nations. Now, it's been a very difficult journey for Pakistan ever since, as security, development, political stability, and representative rule have remained in flux for decades. Pakistan has regularly been caught up in competition between global powers, and domestically successive civilian governments have been overthrown by military intervention, which itself has not been able to fix Pakistan. Now, we've got Geopolity founder Adnan Khan here to discuss this issue today. How are you, Adnan?
I'm good, Yusuf. How are you?
Yeah, I'm doing very well, thank you. Now, I think the best place to start is what was the vision of the founding fathers? What did they actually have in mind for Pakistan, and has this been achieved?
Okay, thanks for that, Yusuf. So, the vision of the founding fathers actually evolved over time. It wasn't the same vision they had at the beginning. It was very different to how things transpired in the end. Obviously, the head of the founding fathers was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Qadi Azam, as they call him, and he was the leader of the Muslims of combined India. And in the early 1900s, he was an Indian nationalist. He called for a separate nation from the British, a self-governed territory. And he had no problem at the time working with the leaders of the Congress Party. The Congress Party, as far as they saw it, represented all Indians. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah started off as an Indian nationalist. This eventually, throughout the 1930s, then turned into Muhammad Ali Jinnah advocating that the Muslims of India are a unique people. They have their own culture, which is different and separate to the Hindus. Therefore, the Muslim uniqueness should be accepted and recognized in any future India. So what he was advocating was a confederation. One India, but Muslims are recognized as Muslims and Hindus are recognized as Hindus. And then his final change in his vision really started in 1940 in what was called the Lahore Resolution. And this was where he first advocated that the Muslims needed their own nation, that they were so distinct from the majority Hindus in India that Muslims and Hindus can't live together and they need their own separate nation. And he advocated the areas of the combined India, which is the northwestern area, which became Pakistan, and then the northeastern area, which became Bangladesh. These areas should become separate territories. So his views evolved over time, and in fact, it was really right near the end, from the 1945 onward, especially the 1946 elections, where he really started advocating quite precipitously that Muslims need to have their own independent nation because of their unique qualities in terms of language, in terms of culture. And it was at this point really you saw a lot of Islamic rhetoric and populism enter into his speeches, enter into a lot of his electioneering. So as far as the Muslims were concerned, whether they were in India or whether they were in Pakistan that became Pakistan, they were Muslims and they wanted to live under their own culture, their own system. So as far as most people are concerned in Pakistan, they fought the British to have their own nation, and that nation was going to represent Muslims, their beliefs, their ideals and their values. As far as the Muslim League were concerned and Muhammad Ali Jinnah, their views and their vision actually evolved over time. And in the end, I mean, it's clear now after 74 years, the vision the people had, the vision the Muslim League and Muhammad Ali Jinnah promised, it's not really been achieved. What you see today, Pakistan, is a mishmash of different ideas, of a bit of nationalism, a bit of Islam, a bit of secularism. This debate isn't even really settled. Even the political class in Pakistan, you've got the more Islamic minded individuals, you've then got the more secular minded individuals, and this is probably one of the main reasons why Pakistan's pulled in so many different directions, so it's unable to move as a whole country in one direction and progress.
Now, in Pakistan, you find that the military actually dominates most of the politics there. How did the military become so strong, and what effect has it had on civilian governments?
So the military became very strong really from the early years of the creation of Pakistan, and there was really one reason for that, and that is because the Muslim League that came to represent the Muslims in combined India, they really didn't have a program, They didn't really have any policies. In fact, the Muslim League represented the elites, the Nawabs, the landlords of Muslim India. So they actually had no strategy, had no plan. So when Pakistan was created, Muhammad Ali Jinnah became Governor General, and really what he did for the 1 year that he ruled is he ensured all powers were in the Governor General role. As we know, when Pakistan was created, you had a migration of between 10 to 14 million people both ways on the border. There were no refugee camps set up. Most of the resources of combined India, whether it was the army, the industrial plants, manufacturing plants, most of it ended up with India rather than Pakistan. And then on top of that, many of the leaders in the Muslim League were quite mediocre individuals. They lacked capability, they lacked governing experience, because the Muslim League really at the time represented the Muslim elites only, not the people on the street. As a result of this, the only institution that seemed to have any semblance of order was the military. So most of the military generals of Pakistan for the first few years were the British generals who managed units in what became Pakistan. And then it was, if I'm in early 50s, where Ayub Khan eventually became the chief of the army. And then over a few years, you saw the army officials shift from being British officers to being Muslims or being Pakistani. So because of the failure of the government, the army was the only institution that functioned, and very eventually in 1956 they did a coup because of the internal differences within the Muslim League. There was also the assassination of the Prime Minister as well in the early 1950s. So because of the failure of the civilian rulers, because of their lack of real vision, their lack of being able to deal with some of the key problems Pakistan was facing, the military stepped in, and 7 decades later that problem's still there.
Now, the divorce between Pakistan and India is still a major factor in the relations between the two nations. It colours their foreign policy, and it creates a lot of problems and tensions between them. Can there ever be a peace between these two nations?
So it's like a divorce between a couple, and they've never quite got over it. Obviously, we still got the first generation who saw partition. Many of them are still around today, and it was quite a bitter divorce. Kashmir still remains a big issue. The way the Muslims were treated when partition happened, up to over 1 million people died because of communal violence that was going on. So relations have really been tense since that period. Pakistan and India have gone to war a couple of times, so relationship remains tense. There's been some call by different army officers and politicians who have tried to push for normalization between India and Pakistan. The problem you really have is the military has pushed both real and imagined grievances about India. So you find that India is a threat. India is backing militants in Balochistan. Many problems in Pakistan are blamed on India. Some are real and some are absolutely not real. So the military has used the India card, that India is the enemy, to shore up their own position. The military is the only organization that can stand up against India. That's the rhetoric the army sells. So with all this rhetoric after decades, it's going to be quite difficult really to normalize relations. And then there's obviously Kashmir as well. So despite attempts by some rulers over the last 74 years, as far as public opinion in both countries goes, each views the other as an enemy. Each views the other as somebody that can't be trusted. And the army in Pakistan especially, they've used this for their own advantage to shore up their position in Pakistan's system.
Now, this point about India being the enemy, a lot of people would argue that this was actually what it was like when the partition first happened. So Pakistan was viewed as land that should actually have been part of India, and India had intentions to annex it. Other people say that there had to be a lot of emphasis on the Pakistani military because a lot of the military bases during the partition ended up on the Indian side of the border. And so Pakistan seems like it's always had an inferiority complex. And so it's always viewed India, and rightly so, as the enemy. How much truth is there to that?
Yeah, there is some truth to that. I mean, apart from Punjab, which was the main military garrison the British had, and that Punjab garrison was important because that would have been the main base that dealt with Russia in the Great Game. So a lot of money was put into that military base. A lot of money was put into Punjab. The canal colonies were created. A lot of money and a lot of perks were given to the feudal landlords in that area in order to shore up Punjab for the British. And you're right, actually, even today, the agreement was in partition that the Muslim majority areas would go to Pakistan and the Hindu majority areas will go to India. Now, the Punjab, as we know today, at that time before partition, you've got what we have in Punjab in Pakistan today, but a lot of it actually goes into India as well. And the Muslims were 51% of Punjab as a province. But what happened was, in the end, is the British carved up Punjab into Muslim majority districts and Hindu majority districts. So they went against their own principle at the time. So there is a feeling by Pakistan that really Agra, Amritsar, these sort of areas should have actually been part of Pakistan. And even in India, a lot of the Sikhs feel that a lot of their temples have ended up in Pakistan. So Guru Nanak's tomb in Kartarpur, that's actually in Pakistan. And many Hindu sites actually ended up in Pakistan. The Hindu view was that Lahore should have really been part of India. That's really what should have happened. So yeah, this all feeds into the India-Pakistan tensions, and it's just another fact amongst many other facts that really still impact relations between the both countries.
Now, you mentioned Kashmir, and this is probably one of the biggest causes of tension between the two nations. Where does this issue stand at the moment, and do you ever see it being resolved?
So, to be honest, successive Pakistani civilian and military regime, they have in effect given up Kashmir. What they do is, because public opinion is against giving up Kashmir, or Pakistan held Kashmir, what you find is that the military and the civilian government, they play it up when they need it, when they need to shore up their position. Other than that, they don't really do anything. So Pakistan's policy towards Kashmir from the beginning was that the whole of Kashmir should have really been part of Pakistan. It was a majority Muslim region, but the leader of the time, Hari Singh, he sided with India, despite the fact that the population was majority Muslim. Now, keep in mind, Kashmir is important because the Indus River and the rivers that go into the north of India, which is where most of the population is, the rivers go through Kashmir that come from the Himalayas. So it's very strategic territory. So Pakistan's view is firstly, it should have been part of Pakistan. Then when the UN got involved, the UN said there should be a referendum, and then the people should decide whether they want to go with Pakistan or India. Pakistan agreed to that, knowing that the majority are Muslim, they're going to want to be with Pakistan. India agreed to it, but has ensured a referendum never takes place, because they know in a referendum the Muslims of Kashmir are going to vote for going with Pakistan. Ever since then, what Pakistan has done is supported and armed jihadi groups to keep a low intensity struggle going in order to bleed the Indian forces to death in India. And that was the Pakistan strategy. Amongst that, you've had a couple of attempts at war. You had 1965 when they went to war, and then you had in 1997-98, if I'm correct, the Kargil conflict. But then 9/11 happened. And after 9/11, America wanted all support for jihadi groups to stop, and Musharraf complied. So what Musharraf did was he banned all the jihadi groups that Pakistan had built up over all those decades. So effectively from that point onwards, Pakistan actually has no resource unless it's going to send its military in to deal with Kashmir. So 2 years ago, when Modi declared the Indian side of Kashmir now to be an integral part of India, there wasn't really a response from Pakistan. There was a lot of rhetoric, but there wasn't really a response. So what you find overall is there's a lot of rhetoric from Pakistan's leaders, whether they're military or civilian. In terms of practical actions, they are doing very little now.
Now, although we've spoken a lot about the failures of Pakistan, there's one thing that could be considered a big success. In 2013, Pakistan's first and only civilian government in 7 decades actually completed its term, and they managed to hand over power to another civilian government. Would you say this is progress? Why have previous governments failed to actually do that in the past?
So yeah, it's quite shocking, that fact actually. The fact that only in 2013 you've really had a civilian government that's ended its term and peacefully handed over to another civilian government. Despite Pakistan being created in 1947, it's taken into the 21st century for this to actually take place. And it really shows you the instability of Pakistan's political system. Now, The reason why governments fail to succeed in Pakistan is it's important to understand that what's really happened is the political system in Pakistan is dominated by a small elite of the population. So you've got the military top brass, you've then got a land owning elite, you've got certain political parties, and then you've got many opportunists. Really, they see the government as really a cash cow for themselves. So what you find is they want to get to power and they want to milk the system for their own personal gain. And that's why multiple governments have been removed due to the sheer corruption that has taken place. Even the military in Pakistan, we have to be honest, it's a corporation. It has business interests and it maintains them, and nobody can really challenge them because they are the strongest. But then on the civilian side, whether it's the Nawaz Sharif family, the Bhutto family, what you find is really they have their own interests, and it's about getting to power and then using this power for their own personal interests. And that's why governments don't succeed in Pakistan. They're not really there to represent the people. They're not really there to solve the problems that people face. They're not really there to develop the country. And that's why Pakistan's political system is really a mess. And that's why the military had to step in. But the military hasn't really done any better. The only difference with the military is they're not as corrupt openly as the civilian governments have been. And just to quote one of Benazir Bhutto's biographers, she admitted in her biography that Benazir Bhutto said to her about the 90s, the decade of democracy, that one of the reasons why she was so corrupt was when her father was overthrown in the 1970s, they went abroad and she experienced a lot of poverty. So her view was, I want to get into power and milk the nation so we don't ever have to go through that again. And that's just an anecdote of the situation of Pakistan. So you have a 200 million population, but then you've got a small elite really who dominate the political system, and they're really there for themselves.
Don't you think that's actually changed now, though, because you've had the first transfer of power in 2013, and then you had another transfer of power from civilian government to another civilian government during Imran Khan's time. So aren't we seeing some sort of progress and change? Aren't things looking better for the country?
Okay, I mean, this is actually the normal argument supporters gave whoever they backed. This was the same argument used by Nawaz Sharif. It was the same argument used by people who supported General Musharraf. And what you find interestingly in each of those cases, things got worse as time went on. Now, you're right, no one's expecting Imran Khan to make some drastic changes in such a short span of time. However, the problem is Imran Khan has actually abandoned most of his big ticket projects. So the change he talked about, the welfare state he talked about, not going to the IMF, well, he's already abandoned that. So if you're going to give him more time, he's just going to abandon even more of what he promised. And this isn't new. This is exactly what all the previous leaders of Pakistan have done. Is you make all these grand promises, and then one by one you really abandon them. Now, this is not like you get in the West where you have a political program and you need time to execute and establish that program. What you've got here in Pakistan is you promise populist policies, and then what you do is you cover your failure or abandonment by lots and lots of rhetoric. So that's why the fact that the economy is sinking and inflation is going through the roof, which is killing people. I mean, many people in Pakistan, they are on daily wages. So what you find is inflation is something that would really, really hurt. On the IMF issue, you've seen he's completely abandoned. On corruption, his own cabinet members created issues in the sugar and the flour industry, in order for them to personally profit. So really, Imran Khan isn't really a change candidate. Really, he's a business as usual candidate. So if you give him more time, really what's going to happen is the corrupt politician and this system will just continue going as it has been.
Let's talk about Pakistan's relationship with America. Now, it always seems like the US imposes itself on Pakistan, and the relations don't seem to be as good as they used to be, especially because US is now accusing Pakistan not actually putting its weight into the region. How would you describe these relations? Is it actually going downhill?
Okay, so Pakistan's relationship with America has always been problematic, primarily because America looks at Pakistan from a transactional perspective. As far as America is concerned, we need you to carry out some services, and if you carry out those services, we will give you some crumbs in the form of loans, in the form of aid, and in the form of military equipment. Pakistan's relationship with America really goes back to even the creation of Pakistan, when it became very clear that the British didn't want a divided India. Really, a divided India, two nations, that really came right at the end in the early 1947. The British view always was they needed a united India because that would be the strongest way for India to stand against the Soviet Union. So seeing this, what Muhammad Ali Jinnah did and the Muslim League did, they started reaching out to the US because it was clear the US was emerging as a new global power. And what Pakistan did at the time is they presented themselves to America as a nation who was also under threat from communist expansion, and that America and Pakistan have the same interest in containing the spread of communism. So the Pakistani leadership, their position was, if you support us and you give us aid, we will become a front in South Asia against the Soviet Union. Now, America was never convinced of this because as far as America saw it, India is the power in the region. India is the larger nation, and America really wanted India to stand up against the Soviet Union. But the Congress Party that was led by Nehru, they had very good relations with the Soviet Union. In fact, they wanted to move away from Britain and actually be close to the Soviet Union, and that's actually what they did in the end. And Nehru kept India out of the Cold War. He didn't really take a side in the Cold War. So eventually America came to the understanding if they can't have India in the region, then Pakistan would be the best bet. So what happened is they gave a lot of aid. Pakistan, they had military treaties were made with Pakistan. But by the end of the 1950s, America realized that a lot of this military aid they're giving, Pakistan's really building themselves up against India. They're not really that interested in the Cold War against the Soviet Union. Pakistani leaders felt the best way to build Pakistan, because the British gave most of the industrial equipment to India, was to get close to America, and that was the easiest and quickest way to build yourself to stand up against India. When America gave Pakistan military equipment in the treaties they had, it was never to use for any purpose other than the Cold War. And these facts that emerged and evolved at the beginning of Pakistan's inception is what has hounded the relationship between both countries. So whenever America's needed Pakistan, America's thrown money at them. It threw money at them in the 1950s in the Cold War. When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in the 1980s, America threw money at it. When America invaded the region again in 2001, America threw money at it. In between that time, America didn't really care about Pakistan. And in fact, in between that time, in between wars in the region, what you even find is America even put sanctions on Pakistan a few times. So America aided Pakistan in developing nuclear weapons. Then throughout the 1990s, America put sanctions on Pakistan for developing nuclear weapons. America gave arms to Pakistan in the early 1950s. When Pakistan went to war with India in 1965, America put sanctions on them for using American equipment to go to war with India. So the problem you've got here is Pakistan is effectively the battered wife in this relationship. However, Pakistan's leaders, they believe the quickest way and the shortest way to develop is to align with America. As far as America is concerned, Pakistan's useful. Whenever we need them, great. However, they don't see them as allies. They're not in an alliance with Pakistan. They don't even see Pakistan as even a regional power. And we're seeing this now, where America is slowly moving towards India, especially now that America's seeing China emerge as a powerful nation in the region.
Now, I feel this topic always comes up time and time again with China and America, and we can see China appearing to muscle its way into Pakistan with things like the CPEC and other investments. Is China replacing US as Pakistan's main foreign policy partner?
So Pakistan and China have a very interesting relationship, because when Pakistan emerged in 1947, it stood against communism. So it stood against the Soviet Union and China. And this is how it presented itself to America. But in 1962, India and China went to war over their borders along the Himalayas. So very quickly, Pakistan realized the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So from there, Pakistan and China developed a relationship which was based on military equipment and economic relations. But the relationship between the both countries is based on one thing, which is India. That is really what it's based on. Beyond that, there is very little relationship between both countries. Obviously, China of today is very different to the China of the 1960s. China is now emerging as an economic power, potentially even a regional power that is pushing back against the US presence in its own region. So for economic purposes, China obviously has developed the Belt and Road Initiative, and a key plank of that is CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. I think the important thing to look at here is the thing Pakistan and China both agree on is India. So at the moment, you'd find China is on a war footing with India in the Himalayas. However, China cannot get Pakistan to open up a front in Kashmir. If Pakistan and China were allies, then they would work together on strategic interests. But what you find is Pakistan has never gone to war with India at the same time when China was going to war with India in the Himalayas. Because India has to fight on two fronts, they physically can't do that. That would indicate that Pakistan now is firmly in the China camp. However, what you find is when America's needed Pakistan in Afghanistan, when it's needed Pakistan to push the Taliban into peace talks, when it's pushed Pakistan to clamp down on the northern areas of Pakistan to make sure they don't support the Afghan resistance, you find Pakistan has completely 100% supported America's action. So what it shows you is beyond the economy, there is very little relationship between Pakistan and China. On the political front, which is the main front, Pakistan is firmly in America's camp. Despite periods of tension, despite the rhetoric, despite the disagreements, Pakistan politically has been serving America's agenda. There's no political agenda Pakistan has served for China, even though they are both on the same side when it comes to India. And until that doesn't change, really, Pakistan is firmly in the American camp.
Now, Adnan, overall, you paint a very bleak picture of Pakistan. How could anyone turn Pakistan around? What would they need to do?
Yes, unfortunately, it would have been better if I could paint a good picture. I mean, don't get me wrong, the people of Pakistan have been let down by successive rulers. Despite that, they still continue. When an earthquake happens in Pakistan, when a flooding happens in Pakistan, the last thing you do is rely on the system. The last thing you do is you rely on the regime. What you rely on is your family, your neighbours and your community. As far as the people of Pakistan are concerned, they've got more confidence in each other than they have in the politicians. Unfortunately, the politicians of Pakistan are literally on the opposite end to where the people are. And that's really where the problem is. To solve this issue, to turn Pakistan around, you have to uproot the system. The system is a tiny elite which consists of the military top brass, which consists of feudal landlords, which consists of opportunist politicians and dynastic families. They are literally milking the political system for their own gain. So until you overturn this, nothing's going to change. And that's why Imran Khan has come, he has done absolutely nothing to change this, despite his rhetoric of change. So you need to change that from a political front. The next thing that needs to be done is the economy needs to be drastically changed. All of Pakistan's economic problems are man-made. The poverty in Pakistan is man-made. It's due to the politicians refusing to even deal with this. So Pakistan, for example, is not even based upon its strengths. So to give an example, 60% of Pakistan's economy is the service sector, but over half of its population works in agriculture. So half the population is making very little contribution to the overall economy. So what you find across the board in Pakistan, the economy is not built upon Pakistan's strengths. So you need to restructure the economy and move into a direction where you build it upon its strengths. And that's how you'd make use of Pakistan's, plentiful resources and its system. On top of that, Pakistan needs a regional and global purpose, and it has that. It has Islam. As far as the people are concerned, Pakistan was created in the name of Islam. So that's why there's always been talk about connectivity in the region. So Central Asia, Afghanistan and Pakistan. That would be a very powerful bloc if you had connectivity there. So throughout the 7 decades of Pakistan's existence, this has been talked about. But what you find is every decade, the Pakistani top brass, they get busy with America's agenda, whether it was the Cold War or whether it's now the war on terror. And this is sold to the people to be the interest of the country, to be the best for Pakistan. And time again, it turns out to be the complete opposite. So really what you need in Pakistan is root and branch change. No amount of elections, reform is going to change this, become an entrenched system. However, you've got 200 million people who have no confidence in the politician and the system. They don't even rely on the system when it comes to their challenges. And on a day-to-day level, the state doesn't even exist as far as most people are concerned. So that's why it's actually easy to overturn this system, because this system is not entrenched in the lives of people. It obviously has an aspect of influence over people because they're the state. As far as most people are concerned, the state has very little it has very little to do with them in their daily lives. And all of this really means is change is actually very feasible.
Thanks for your time today, Adnan. If you want to learn more about the issues raised today, please check out our website www.thegeopolity.com, all one word. You can also learn more on other issues by accessing our website, where you'll find comprehensive insights. I'm Yusuf, thanks for listening, take care.